So I'm George Loudon, you could say the cause of all this disturbance in the guitar world. I started this in 1974, just as a very young guy, didn't know anything about anything, and just got started with a book and wanted to make really good guitars, and that's how it all began, back in the hippie days. To be honest, I never really thought of it in those terms at all. All I wanted to do was to learn, first of all, how to make a good acoustic, but using my own designs rather than trying to, copy. So that was all I had in mind, and very unusually, well, a bit of a surprise for me was the fact that suddenly there were some people who really liked them in Paris, and then Geneva, and then London, and it just kind of went on from there, and then it became a brand after that. But I had no intention for that to happen, just wanted to make the guitars exceptional if I could. And so I guess that's why it's happened. First of all, you have to remember when I started, there was no internet. So I couldn't go online and find out how to bend a guitar side or carve a neck or anything like that. So I was starting from a very naive standpoint, and also I wasn't aware that actually there was a small school in the East End of London I could have gone to learn some of the basics. So I had to learn everything the hard way, and it would have been easier if I'd taken a guitar, a well-known guitar, let's say a Martin or a Gibson or whatever in those days, and copied it, and then that would have saved me a lot of trouble. But in fact, because I didn't do that and just tried to design my own guitars, they developed their own way and they had their own sound. And if I'm, say for example, designing a new guitar like a small guitar, I'm always aware that, for example, a small guitar is going to sound very, very easily very good in the treble strings, but on the bass it could be very weak. So I'm trying to find ways to, from my experience over the last 48 years, trying to find ways to make the bass come out more. And on a bigger guitar like our O series, it was trying to make sure the bass wasn't too loud and making sure the treble came out properly. So there's all these kind of things that I'm constantly working on all the time with the voicing. It's not an exact science. In fact, it's not really a science at all. It's more to do with instinct and experience and the things you learn over the years. I designed this, changed the bracing this way, and then I listened to the result and learned something from that. And I've done that, countless times. That's a continuing process. So the first guitar I designed was what is now called the O series. So it's a larger, the larger shape. It's probably a little bit smaller than, it's bigger than a dreadnought. And that was the style of guitar I started with, and it suited fingerstyle players very well. So at the beginning, a lot of people who played Celtic music, loved the guitar because it was so, the sound kind of percolated out there from this quite big instrument. And then I thought, around about 1980, 81, I thought, I'd like to build a mid-sized guitar, and maybe it would be good for flat picking. So it was called the F series. But in fact, turned out that yes, it was good for flat picking, but it also could be very good for a lot of other styles. Very versatile. That's a mid-sized one. And then after that, I designed the S model, which is probably now my favorite, personally. This is an S model that I have in my hands, and as you can hear, it is very loud, but it also has a good bass and a good warmth to it. So that was my aim with the small guitar, to try and make sure it wasn't too boxy in tone. And I think I'm quite happy with that. It's loud enough, but it sounds sweet and warm. And then finally I designed the Wii, what we've called the Wii, wasn't sure what to call it at the beginning, but then I realised everything in Northern Ireland is wee this and wee that, and so we called it the Wee Loudon, and that was designed for Ed Sheeran, specifically for him, and then it became quite popular after that as well. So, but it's even more difficult because it's so small. It's quite difficult to get the voicing right with that, and it turns out that it's very good for ragtime. It's exceptionally good when you plug it in, because the acoustics are slightly suppressed because of the small size. So plugging it in works just almost better than any of the models. What happened was Gary Lightbody from Snow Patrol, you know, who has quite a few of my guitars, he asked me would I make a guitar for Ed as a gift from Gary. And I realized when I went on the net that Ed was using very small guitars and I didn't make one. So I had to go and design one, which I did. I went up to the North Coast in Northern Ireland and designed this, the Wee, what became the Wee. And then I noticed that Ed was still using, you know, the Martin on stage, but he was using my guitars for all his recording, and I was kind of quite surprised and wondering why he wasn't using mine on stage as well as recording. And then his manager said to me one day, he said, "George, you know, the problem with your guitars on stage is they're too good." And I had, what does he mean, you know? And so, but I went home and I thought about it, and I took the Wee Loudon and I changed the size of it. I took quite a lot of the depth of the body off it, and then I stiffened up the inside bracing to make it slightly more compressed, and took it over to his sound man. Sound man played it through the rig, and it was immediately, this is absolutely perfect for stage. And they took it to Singapore the next day, and then from that day on, Ed has used the stage version of the Wee Loudon on stage all the time. So that's how that all came about. And then Ed came to me, and you know, we got to know each other over those years, and Ed asked me if I would, you know, consider making a guitar which was affordable for younger people. Quite difficult to do that in Ireland. You know, a lot of times these guitars would be made in China or Mexico. So to try and do it in Ireland was a bit of a challenge. But we've done it, and the guitars are now available, and at a reasonable price, you know, for a guitar that's built in Ireland. Yeah. So the biggest challenge is the man hours, you know, and the cost of manufacturing in Ireland, or England, or Europe, anywhere. The manufacturing costs are very high compared to Indonesia or China or Mexico. Very, very high. So that's the main challenge: is how do you do it without losing money, you know? So, but I believed in enough, you know, to give it a real good go and do a lot of research, and we approached it in a very kind of high-tech way. Unlike the Loudon guitars, you know, we approached the Sheeran by Loudons using very high-tech processes that we developed ourselves. So we've got some processes that nobody else uses in the world to make them, but it's still a challenge, you know. So for Loudon, the processes that we use right now are pretty much the same that we've been using right from the very beginning. You know, I started 48 years ago, and some of the processes are better, but for the most part, it's an awful lot of handwork. You know, using Japanese chisels, Japanese saws, spoke shaves, planes, and so on. But we also have developed a few sort of processes in there to take some of the labor out of it, you know, to some of the more laborious tasks. For example, if you take a square piece of wood and try to carve it into a guitar neck, it's an awful lot of hard work. So we usually start the processes off with some woodworking machines, and then we finish everything off by hand. And we do a lot of things with Loudon that that no other manufacturer does. For example, we even split the bracing wood, so we don't just saw it and shape it. We actually split it first, you know, to find where the grain line is, and that takes time. But it's important. It's one of those small things, and if you've got, let's say, 10 small things that you pay a lot of attention to, it makes a difference to how the guitar breathes and how the guitar responds, you know, to when you're playing it. So it's an awful lot of handwork. There are some limited machine processes in at the beginning as well. So we've got about, I suppose there would be about 25, 26 craftspeople making the Loudon guitars, and probably every guitar would probably be worked on by about 8 or 10 people, I would say.
Amazing. It's not a lot of people, really, is it?
No, it's not. It's a very, you know, it's good to keep it small like that if we can. I mean, we're only making about 30 odd guitars a week at the moment, and we're not planning on making any more than 40 in the near future, you know. I mean, the demand is very good, but we would like to keep it very slow and sustainable, and we value our staff a lot, so we want to make work rewarding for them. So it's not so much a big industrial type thing. And I think it shows in the guitars when you start to play them. You know, they breathe and they respond quickly, and each one's got its own character slightly. You know, it's not a, they're not all exactly the same. I mean, some of them would be, but you know, for example, we would try to use woods that you know, a larger manufacturer couldn't use because they couldn't get large enough quantities of them to use. So we will use mountain rosewood from Central America. We'll use even use cocobolo, for example. We'll use Claro walnut, Bastogne walnut, which is quite hard to find. We'll use of course, Indian rosewood's a very standard wood, and we use that as well. But we'll use other rosewoods. We'll use African blackwood, for example, which is hard to find in big quantities, if not virtually impossible. Brazilian rosewood also, covered by CITES, so it's very hard to find, and you have to get a license for every piece. So, but all these woods, they do, each of them provide nuances of tone, and you know, real musicians, sometimes a certain guitar can speak to them, and they're not more than others, and they're not sure exactly why. And sometimes it could be partly the wood as well as the design. So yeah, very, very privileged to be able to work with all kinds of different woods and try different woods out, you know. Oh, I mean, it's totally like that. I always had, you know, this goes back to my father, actually, because when I told my dad, I was aged about 23 at the time, and when I told him that I was going to make guitars for a living, he's kind of, you know, some parents would sort of think, oh, right, okay, you know, he's going to make guitars. Yeah. But my dad just looked at me and he said, well, just make sure they're good ones. That's all he said. And that was the way I was thinking about it. I wanted to make something world class if I could, but I didn't know anything about anything, so I had to start from the ground up and learn how to use tools, learn how to make guitars first before I learned how to make, you know, good ones, as my dad would have said. You know, so quality is the number one. We never compromise on that. You know, the viability of the business comes. It's still important. You have to have a good business if you're going to make world-class guitars, but we never compromise on quality. And we've got a very good team now working in the company. A real good team, dedicated people who focus on what they're doing and take quality very, very seriously. So never had a better team. It's really fantastic. Got about 26 there now. Yeah, so there definitely is, you know, for example, a lot of songwriters like the we on the S because they're so convenient. They're sitting at home writing songs or whatever. They're so convenient. There's such a nice size to play. It's not a big instrument. It's easy to handle. You know, it's easy to pick up off the floor and try a few notes. And so songwriters really like the smaller guitars. The mid-size, the F, is very versatile. You know, you can have blues players playing those. You can get more folky players, more Celtic type music players. And you can get flat pickers, you know. More and more flat pickers are beginning to realize that the F does work very well for that. And then the O, the big guitar, well, yeah, honestly, it's one of those, it's the very first one that I designed, and I've got all sorts of players using those. Just because of that big sort of complicated, complex, interwoven kind of sound that comes out of them, you know. Celtic music players, finger pickers. Not so many flat pickers wouldn't tend to use the O as much, but certainly fingerstyle players, people like Pierre Bensusan, for example, and many others. Thomas Lieb, and a lot of really good, like Thomas plays a lot of, you know, percussive guitar. So yeah, the O is very versatile as well, but not for flat picking, generally, you know. Unless you're using a light pick. If you're using a light pick, the way some Irish music players would use for strumming, then it works very well for that. We certainly talk to local artists for sure, and you know, we have several who would come down every now and again, you know, to test out some of the guitars, and some very good players over there. As I know there are everywhere these days, there's a lot of good players. So yeah, certainly I listen to players and I invite them to give me feedback, you know, on the guitars. But there's nothing particularly about Northern Ireland, I don't think, other than the fact it's a very small community and everybody knows everybody else, you know, what kind of way. So there's very few really good guitar players that I don't know or who don't know me over there. So that's good, you know, the fact that it's quite a close-knit sort of community. So first of all, I'm 71. So you know, my time at the bench is very limited now. But I still do all of the designs, although that will be changing, you know, over the next few years. At least one of my sons will be doing that once I sort of start to step back. But at the moment I do all the design work, and I do, you know, the quality standards, and I help with the training, and I help with the Master Series. So we have a very small number of Master Series guitars that I make with my sons and with a couple of other really good guys. There's only about one a month of those available, but so I still get involved in that. And so yeah, I just keep my hand in, and I don't like too much office work and administration and that sort of thing, but I have to do some of it, of course, just like everybody else. But my main thing is the quality of the guitars, the design of the guitars, and designing new models, you know, with, you mentioned the Fanfret and the jazz models, you know, you know, those designs had to be very carefully thought out. They weren't just variations on something we were already doing. And then also the electrics, you know, I designed those from scratch and very proud of them. And then from next year, we'll be introducing some new models there that I designed a couple of years back, but haven't made the prototypes yet. So yeah, that's really what it is. I think two things really. I think when you said one thing, but I think probably two. So the guitars themselves, first of all, that they are. I remember a Japanese guy that worked for me, really great luthier. Some years ago, he said, "You know, George, what I really like about your guitars is that they're honest." And he used the word honest, and I had to think about that. What he meant was that it wasn't all sort of bling and trying to attract people through lots of inlays everywhere and stuff like that. It was really just a real honest instrument that responds to the musician. And that's, I think, my biggest achievement. And the next one would be the culture of the company, that it's a company that's built upon respect for people. So that would be the craftspeople, but also the people that supply us with the wood, for example, and also the customers, that we treat customers properly. At least we try to. So I think that those are the two things that I feel are the biggest achievement. It's not just a business, you know, that to make money. It's a business to treat people properly if possible. That's not always easy in a business context, you know. I think it does. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not the easiest business as a business, you know, because it's a craft, and you know you're working with wood, and wood always surprises you. You know, sometimes wood just doesn't behave properly, and you know you have to take that on board and take it on the chin when it happens. But yeah, it's not easy necessarily. I mean, if I was making something, you know, if I was making a piece of furniture or something, it would be, of course, more boring, but it would be easier to do, probably. And mass producing something is always easier than doing it the way we do it, you know, in a limited way. So I'm very happy with that. I like to have, we are growing, you know, altogether there's 86 people in the company right now, so it's not that small. But I like to grow slowly so that the culture doesn't get sort of diluted, if you like, as it grows, which would be the natural tendency, you know. Well, no, not really. I mean, next year we've got some new acoustic models coming that we're coming. For example, we have some church pew mahogany again. We got a whole load of very old church pews, and we're making a few models from that wood. That wood could be 60, 80, 100 years old or more, and of a kind of mahogany that you can't really get anymore. So very excited about that. The other thing is that I have a couple of, as I said, a couple of electric models that I designed a couple of years ago that I am going to introduce now next year. So those would be the two of the things. There are a few other ones as well.